Hello, I'm Jonathan, also known as the Medieval Genie, and we're going to have a look at my hand-forged Christmas and examine some items that I made over the Christmas period, most especially on Christmas Day itself, and have a look at the processes and mistakes and successes and new ideas that went into making them. So let's have a look at the few items. So the item I took was basically just an old chisel that I got in some sort of scrap sale. I got a whole load of items for about £5, and this was one of the items that I got. So there was nothing special about it. It was a chisel. You can see, if I show you closer, part of the original design, which had a hexagonal type of shaft, and then what I did was I forged it out and tapered the end into a square shape and made it narrow enough so it would actually fit properly into the hardy hole. I've done a bit of grinding so that the chisel head could be a bit sharper, also because I was hitting things on top of it with a hardened steel hammer and those soft still steel bars and rods on top of it. I have needed to sharpen this a couple of times because it was getting almost completely flat, but apart from that it's been very effective so far. So next up, we've got these two little keyring pieces. Now a bit of a shout out to Alex Steele, the blacksmith, who's got his own very popular channel, and for good reason, recommended that actually one of the first things that someone should make is little bits like this, as well as other small items, to practice hammering and, general blacksmithing technique by trying to make several of these items, and indeed I'll continue making more and more of these sorts of small items to refine my technique so I can move on to things like I really want to do, such as bladesmithing, rather than trying to rush it too much. Now with these, I was trying to make some leaf designs, which didn't exactly go well, and some curling, which involved using pliers for the curls, general hammering, and then of course a bit of flattening and doming out and whatnot for the leaf shapes. Now the actual original items were tangs which I'd sawn off of some files which I was using for making some blades. So those parts looked like they were useless, but I decided to keep the material around just in case, and what do you know, it actually came in handy to make these sorts of decorative items instead. Our next items are these, which are coat hangers. Now of course they don't match. I'm not good enough at blacksmithing yet to make some fairly matching items, but they still serve the trick. So of course the design is fairly simple, and I actually started off with the actual rod that I'd split in twain, and then I'd flattened it out around the part that's going to have a hole punched in it. I don't know if it's a hot punch, cold punch or some other tool. I'm not an expert blacksmith, but I had something that could make holes, put it over what's called the Pritchell hole, which is a small round hole in the anvil, and then basically hammered through to make this hole, rather than actually using a drill. Besides that, I was tapering out the bottom parts to make sure they'd have, hook parts, and they weren't round, but they were more sort of square rather than flat rectangular cross section. And then at the ends I tried to make some decorative ornamenting with varying levels of success. At the end of it, I then made sure to use the horn of the anvil, which is used for making curves, and then basically hammer it to curl it round there. I don't know what the original item was that I made it out of, but it's some sort of strange object I got in my scrap buy, which had two ends which looked like screwdriver ends, and then a round rod going through the middle for a few inches. So there was a bit of stretching out of the material to make them longer into these coat hooks, but the actual item itself was fairly close-ish to the sorts of dimensions I needed already. It was just a matter of doing the flattening and then the stretching out to make the actual sort of pinning ends here with the holes, and then the hook ends at the bottom. it should be mentioned that in the meantime, I was melting copper. Now, I've seen certain items like aluminium and whatnot, which you get certain things like foil, or I get bits of brass, and there seem to be impurities and things which get all mixed up and it becomes quite difficult. But one of the materials that I have consistently been able to melt and even cast, which I'll show later, into parts more easily has been copper. Now it melts at around 1000 degrees Celsius, so if you can get iron in a forge yellow or white hot so that it's very soft and easy to forge, you've got enough heat in there so that in the meantime you could melt copper, either doing it sort of both at once, multitasking, or doing them separately and focusing specifically on the task. It depends on your approach, but you can see I was able to cast out this ingot. I have punched my name in there, just the JG initials, and of course later on you'll see that I've been able to melt down those ingots and then recast it into some interesting shapes. And hopefully I'll be able to use things like casting sand to melt more complex shapes and get unique items that I could use for jewellery, parts to fit onto other blacksmithed items, or other things later on. So there are a couple of things I learnt while I was making this. Firstly, that I needed to plan ahead and look at what things I'd forged earlier and what things I'd forged later, because certain parts towards the end were difficult to heat up in a forge just because I didn't have enough space in a propane forge to fit the entire item inside. So I had to carefully consider which parts I was doing when and how. Apart from that, you should bear in mind that I wasn't using pre-bought, pre-made mild steel or something that I knew what it was. This was just some scrap. And I actually, when I was quenching it, just to finish off the product, I ended up with, I'll see if the camera can focus on it enough. Yeah, here you can see a couple of cracks. This isn't catastrophic, but it means that if I was making something like a sword or something that needed more structural integrity around this area, then, something that's going to be used and potentially take some sort of impact or wear, then this would have been destroyed in the process. And the reason is because I think this is actually made of some sort of tool steel. I should have realised, because there would be a lot of strain when you're putting the torque onto a car's, bolts and things. But I hadn't, I just assumed it was a mild steel, and I quenched it, which is why it's got the cracks. So it was harder to work while I was forging it, and I thought it was because it was thicker material, but it's actually got more carbon content. But apart from that, like I say, when I quenched it, that's why those cracks formed up. So it's always worth bearing in mind that you'll have different materials, and you should try to guess, based on what the item used to be, what sort of metal will be used. If it's just some sort of frame from a table, it'll probably be some sort of mild steel. If it's a tool like this, then it's got a chance it'll be some sort of higher carbon steel. They'll be harder to work and also harden more if you quench it, which can be useful if you're making certain tools like knives, hatchets and other things, but also means that you have to be careful not to overwork it and cause damage to it. Our final item is this. Now, of course, at the moment it is just a little sort of lozenge item, but when I've got the time, possibly today or tomorrow, I will be putting my mother's name in there using the same punch set I've got with lettering, and I'll also drill a hole through the side or front so you can put a string or chain or something like that through it, and then it'll become a pendant. Or it can turn into another item, like if I had a pair of these, they could turn into fairly heavy earrings, so I probably won't do that, so we'll be looking at it turning into a pendant. So it's a very nice item. I used a mould that I got for Christmas to cast it, and basically I took it to the grinder. I used the bench grinder and a belt sander to remove some material, and I found that it was very difficult to hold on to. Using my gloves, it was almost impossible to hold on to properly, and even using very grippy pliers, it was still tough to hold on to, and I don't know if I caught it on camera, but it actually ended up coming out of my hands and getting under and into the grinding wheel, which could have been dangerous, so I immediately switched the tool off and decided that I'd do some work hardening, which is something you can do with copper, where instead of, you know, getting something hot and forging it, with copper you can use it cold, put it on an anvil, and then just hammer it, which actually made me form it into the shape that I wanted without needing to use heat or any complicated tools. I literally got a pair of pliers and then got the hammer and just hammered it into the shape I wanted, which was surprisingly easy, and it didn't form any cracks in the meantime. So that was it for our hand-forged Christmas. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Don't worry, it isn't going to become a blacksmithing only channel. I'll be back to looking at fighting arts and history and stuff like that as well, and this will be more of a side thing, which I hope will develop into sufficient skills that I can look at blacksmithing things like blades, for example. So I'll be looking at your wishes. If you want me to look at trying to make specific items, I'll see if I can accommodate your wishes, and eventually I'll see if I can look at making maybe a Type 14 arming sword, or a Cinque Dea dagger, or other fancy items like that, of more relevant types. I hope you guys have a happy new year, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Ta-ra for now.